Enchanté.
Hello everyone and welcome. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our first ever summit on the future of cars. I hope you can hear me all right. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise and I'm coming to you from a virtually car-free central London. We've got people from other time zones and other places, but it's really quite striking. Again, welcome. When we first discussed arranging this and what to call it, my initial response, obviously, immediately was to go back to Greece and say electrifying. I think in the end, we went with something a little more nuanced and grown up, but it is electrifying. It's incredibly timely that we're having this conversation, these conversations now. In automotive terms, we are on a hinge of history, but you don't have to be a car nut, still less a petrol head, to understand that something seismic is happening. We have nearly 1.5 billion cars in the world. All of them are being pensioned off over the next couple of decades because of what's under the hood. And they're going to be replaced with zero emission powertrains of one sort or another. And if you'll forgive me, just a very brief personal anecdote. Years ago, I was a reporter in LA on the day when General Motors launched its EV1, a car that looked a bit like a pill, but drove very nice and smoothly in the mid-90s. And I test drove it along with a lot of other journalists, I think from the new Getty Center down to Marina del Rey, back up the 405 freeway, by which time it was pretty much out of juice. But it was still a car that won a lot of affection and it sold to a lot of celebrities, but it fizzled. Partly, famously, because it was sort of self-sabotaged by GM, but also it was only ever conceived as an answer to Californian air quality requirements. Well, 30 years on, EVs are happening on a global scale. Every major manufacturer is committed to switching more or less their entire model ranges to battery electric or hybrid. And this is a chance to get it right. And today we're going to have 5 sessions. The first 2, we're going to drill down as much as we can on how to get that right. How to make the most of EVs, how to charge them cleanly, how to get more of them on the road. We're also going to talk about the future of autonomous driving, assuming there is one. We're going to work out and vote on the best car ever, the Tortoise Oscars of cars. And finally, we'll talk about the past and present and future of car culture. But I don't want to carry on any longer because we've got barely 50 minutes and a lot to talk about. Briefly, though, this is a think-in. That's the format. We want everybody to pitch in as much as possible. If you've been to one before, you'll know the drill. You can do so. Let us know that you want to talk by raising your digital hand on the bottom instruction panel. But you can also chat in the chat, and my colleague Luke Bedimer is monitoring that, and we may come back to 1 or 2 of his brilliant slides if necessary to remind us of some key stats during the conversation. But we've got some great guests with us today. We have Fredrika Klarén, who is head of sustainability at Polestar, who we're partnering with for this summit. We're very grateful for Polestar's support. They build EVs, and there's one behind Fredrika there. We're joined by Macdonald-Brown, who's CEO of Syzygy, right at the cutting edge of putting renewable power into EVs. And we're also very lucky to be joined by Kerry McCarthy, MP for Bristol East. And I want to come to Kerry first, hello, because we are a newsroom and we've kind of had some news this week in that your colleague, Ed Miliband, the Shadow Business Secretary, Kerry, I should explain, is the Shadow Minister for Green Transport. But Ed Miliband set out in a speech Labour's vision for what I believe you're calling an EV revolution in the UK. So can you first sketch out for us what that involves? Because clearly a key part of making the most of the environmental potential of EVs is getting more of them on the roads, ending the period when they're a niche product for people who can afford them and making them a mass product. So can you say how Labour plans to do that, but also then come back to the specific point that we want to get at in this first session, which is how Labour would make sure that the power going in is clean?
Okay, so I guess the starting point is in our 2019 manifesto, Labour called for a ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. The government had been committed to 2040, then it said it would consult and was looking at around 2035, but we've had the good news in the last few months that the government is now going for a 2030 ban, although for hybrids it's 2035, which is something that I would have preferred to have seen hybrids brought into 2030 as well. So that's the starting point. Question is, how do we get there? And particularly, you can't leave it till 2030 for people to start buying the EVs, because you want to develop a really good second-hand market so that people can afford, people who can't afford new cars. So what we're calling for is a stimulus package with things like interest-free loans for up to 1 million people so that they can afford to buy EVs. The government's actually been cutting the grants over the last couple of years. So you used to be able to get a £3,500 plug-in grant. It was cut to £3,000 last year, cut again to £2,500 this year, and also the grants that you can get for the charging infrastructure at home have been cut, which seems entirely counterproductive. Yes, the market is responding. Yes, companies are starting to respond to that 2030 deadline by producing new EVs, and we'll see a lot more on the market. I mean, last year, I think about 108,000 EVs were purchased despite the COVID lockdown.
In the UK?
But it's just in the UK, yes. So they actually, considering that other car sales were incredibly badly hit, people did respond to an extent, but that's not going to get us to where we need to be, and we need to get there much faster. So Labour, as I said, is talking about interest-free government loans, as well as investing in things like part financing 3 gigafactories to produce EV batteries. Because what's also really important is we've got to seize this moment in terms of car manufacturing in this country, because if we don't invest in that, and if we don't invest in the associated things like the battery production, it will all go overseas. And what you're seeing is huge investment from Germany and France, for example, in this sector, and we're not seeing the equivalent in the UK. So turning to the other point about the underlying...
Kerry, can I just pick you up on that point? Because it's a key political point at the moment, isn't it? Even if it's straying slightly from our agenda. There are plans, as I understand it, by BMW to build battery-powered Mini Coopers in Oxford, Nissan to build battery-powered cars in Sunderland. Is it your understanding that is... vulnerable to being moved elsewhere? And if so, what would you do to keep them here?
I mean, France is putting £8 billion into supporting this sector. Germany's putting £6 billion in. And as I said, we're not seeing that stimulus package. What we're calling for as part of the Green Recovery Package, I think it's been dubbed, is a rapid stimulus over the next 18 months to actually make sure, not just, obviously the UK has been really badly hit by COVID, both in terms of the public health impacts, but also in terms of the economic impact. And again, what you're seeing is Germany's got a 36 billion stimulus package, France 27 billion, Labour's calling for 30 billion over the next 18 months now, so that we can invest in that infrastructure. And if you actually look, investing in the infrastructure level, that is the quickest way to reduce emissions, but also it has a real multiplier effect. And I think there's a real risk that if we don't support that sector, and we don't take a very proactive response. We had this dilemma back after the financial crash, didn't we? And there were various measures that were brought in then, like the scrappage scheme and that, to try to make sure that we protected the sector here. And I think the Chancellor's just not ideologically on that page, that he sort of feels that there's, he's very much of the view that the market will take care of itself. And I think that we'll find that we are left behind if we don't take a more proactive approach.
Okay, Kerry. Well, let's move on before we come to Fredrika, because I'm interested to compare the Swedish case. How does would Labour fix the energy mix, as it were, so that when we do plug in, once we can afford to, whether it's secondhand or with an interest-free loan or both, the power is renewable? That's a question for you, Kerry.
Oh, sorry. I thought you
no,
said at the start that you were turning to somebody else, right?
We will.
Yeah.
I just want to be able to compare the UK and Sweden on this. But what are Labour's plans to make sure that when we plug in, we're plugging in renewable power?
Well, I mean, obviously the trajectory is moving towards renewables, and we've been quite successful in terms of shifting that energy supply. But I think that is, that is part of the £30 billion package that I talked about in terms of investing in that infrastructure and helping to make that shift more rapidly. I mean, you've got some suppliers, like I think Ecotricity is just increased, that they've sort of you'll find on the motorway network there's quite a lot of Ecotricity chargers. They're now just increasing their offer. They're putting in new charging points, and obviously that's a renewable energy company. But you're quite right that we need to make sure that it's not just that it is clean electricity. And it's the same in terms of hydrogen. You know, we need to make the shift to green hydrogen rather than just presenting hydrogen in itself as the answer to all our problems.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And already in the chat, people have been asking about what is hydrogen on our agenda today? It's a really interesting question. It's also a little bit of a rabbit hole. I mean, my take on recent announcements here is that the automotive industry is basically betting on batteries over fuel cells. So in that sense, hydrogen is being marginalized again for now. Though of course, Lillian, I take your point. It's a huge subject in the broader clean energy discussion. Fredrika, let me come to you in Sweden. Where, as I understand it, the energy mix is already 100% renewable if you're lucky enough to be plugging in an electric car. Tell us about the size
at least mainly fossil free. I don't see if nuclear can be said to be renewable or not. It's more fossil free. Yeah.
But tell us about the size of the EV fleet in Sweden and the energy mix that's going in there.
Yeah. So hearing Kerry talk about UK plans is just another testament to the amazing thing that we are seeing now, that governments are really backing up the EV revolution in a really inspiring and hopeful way. And in Sweden, we see, in fact, clear numbers indicating that we are on the way of succeeding in that also in Sweden. I think it's 1 in 5 new cars in Sweden that are today purely electric. And as an EV driver in Sweden, even though you still have struggles finding charging stations, we really need to build more charging stations. At least you can feel confident that you mainly get fossil-free electricity while charging. And why that is so important is because at Polestar, we utilize life cycle assessment to assess the carbon footprint of our cars. Polestar 2, behind me, has a smaller carbon footprint than a comparable fossil car, regardless of how you charge it. So if you use the global electricity mix or the EU electricity mix or renewables, it still has a smaller footprint over the lifetime. But if it's charged with renewable, it has half the footprint of a fossil car. It's an amazing difference between if you charge with the mixes or if you can charge with only renewable.
That's over its lifetime, is that right?
Over its lifetime, yes.
And what are you saying is the lifetime of an average EV?
Well, there is an ongoing debate about that. So it's a really sensitive issue, but somehow we have to pick a number when we do these assessments, and it would be great if everyone would pick the same numbers. But I'm not going to get into LCA methodology too much, but we estimate that this car will roll for 200,000 kilometers during its lifetime, and it could be much above that. So we are doing a conservative estimation, and that is something I think it's important to be clear about. But what we see also is the fact that we need to empower consumers to really accelerate this change. We need to halve the emissions during this decade. If we can, instead of only have a small decrease of the carbon footprint of the cars that we make compared to fossil, and really go for halving that carbon footprint, that will have a major impact on the development that we need to see during the coming decade. So we really want to empower consumers, and we feel that the industry needs to be more guiding in terms of what are the product-related emissions of these cars, so you can pick the best one, but also how can you impact the carbon footprint when you charge. And this is where we're now seeing a lack of transparency also when it comes to the charging network. It's really hard to know what kind of energy you're charging with as a consumer.
Are you speaking globally now? I mean, from what you say, in Sweden, it's not hard. You can be pretty certain it's fossil fuel free.
Absolutely, unless it's really cold and we need to import energy, of course. So it's not 100% of the case, but you can be fairly confident in Sweden that you're getting renewable energy. But this is not the case globally, and we need this transition to happen on a global scale. Mm-hmm. And looking at, we're investigating what is the situation in terms of renewable energy in the global charging network that is now being built. And we simply cannot say that we know. We can't extract data. There is no transparency on data relating to this, except for in some countries where we see positive tendencies around that. But then when you get the data, you basically see that the share of renewable energy in the charging networks is really low, basically lower than the average electricity mix in the country. And this is what we're hearing is because when you're building a charging station, the business case is really hard. So you're basically choosing the cheapest electricity that you can find. John can probably talk more about this later on, but that is kind of the analysis that we're doing right now and what we're seeing.
So that's really interesting. I mean, talk a little bit more about, if you can, about the business case for investing in charging infrastructure. Are you saying that as it's currently happening in the territories that you've studied, because I know that Polestar has done some research here, including in the US, that there isn't enough state support, for example, to do it without shopping around for the cheapest power and therefore sometimes the dirtiest?
Well, that is the conclusion we're coming to, of course. But we also see positive tendencies here. So looking at workplace charging stations, they tend, at least in the data that we are getting, tend to have a higher degree of renewable energy. And so when you, as an employer, want to really support your employees in transitioning into an EV, and you want them to be able to charge, that is a part of your sustainability strategy, of course. And then you do the active choice. You see the business case in going for renewable energy. It's really clearly linked to why you're doing this. And we think that is something that we can learn from. And I hope that a lot more charging operators will copy.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to John now, but after that, Luke, if you could get ready with just the one slide that shows the life cycle carbon footprint of EVs depending on your power source. That might be a good visual prompt so that we know exactly what we're talking about.
And that is the specific case for Polestar. So it's not the average car, it's a Polestar, right?
Yes. but it's still illustrative.
Yeah.
John, let me come to you. Tell us your vision for how to ensure in a trickier territory than Sweden, like the UK, where you work, that the juice that is going in is as clean as possible, and how, as to use Fredrika's formulation, how to empower consumers to know that that's what they're buying.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning. Yeah, it's. I mean, this is a place we all want to get to, and I think perhaps there's been a lot more progress in this in the UK than perhaps I think a lot of people realise. Last year, 40% of all of the electricity that was consumed in the UK, so 40% came from renewable energy, and 70% of that was wind, hydro, and solar. But we all want to get that to a much higher level. And in fact, just as a quickie, renewable energy last year, for the first time ever, put more power onto the grid than fossil fuels in the UK. So we have about 230 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour in the UK, something like that. China has 700 grams. So when you're looking at where things are manufactured, that has a massive impact on embodied carbon. But to your point, we want to increase the government and political parties of all persuasions want to increase the amount of renewable energy onto the grid. And there is a huge way for us to go. And there is scope to simply continue bolting things onto our grid. But we are coming quickly to the point where we can't continue to bolt things that are much of which rather is intermittent, solar, wind, and so on. So what happens is, in layman's terms, is the grid becomes imbalanced. And so in order to balance the grid, you need to balance the grid to allow for more renewable energy to be connected. And in order to do that, we are going to need storage. Now, you have, and this is the kind of, I think, the beautiful thing about the electric vehicle revolution is, yes, there'll be utility scale storage. So you'll see, and it's already happening, containerized solutions bolted on to strategic parts of the grid. But actually, we're driving around in cars. My car has a 90 kilowatt hour battery. The average Nissan Leaf is I think 35 or 50 kilowatt hours. To give the listeners of some context, the average house uses about 8 to 10 kilowatt hours. A 3-bedroom house, 8 to 10 kilowatt hours a day is what we use at home. So if I could, sadly, I live in a terraced house on a street in London, so I don't have at home charging. But if I did, I could power my house for over a week off my car. And what that leads us into is this whole area, which is fascinating, of vehicle to grid technology. So now there are a limited amount of vehicles that are actually capable of doing this at the moment, but there's no question, and I'd be interested in Fredrika's view, that the manufacturers are all going to have to go down this route, including also the charge point manufacturers, because you need a charging point and you need a car that is able to effectively put power from your car back into the grid, and you'll have millions of small power plants keeping the grid stabilized. The more of that we have, the more renewable energy we can then put onto the grid.
John, can I just interrupt you there because I want to sort this out in my head before we go any further. And by the way, I can hear you, but I can't hear you very well. I don't know if that's the case for other people. It may be, I don't know what kind of a microphone you're using. And it's fine. It's fine. We can.
I'll shout.
Yeah. But clearly, cars, EVs putting power back into the grid have to have been charged at some point. So just so we're clear, this is a discussion about leveling out supply, right? And my question is, to work, does it depend on cars sitting idle, in other words, not moving almost as much as they always do? Because the numbers there are quite extraordinary. I mean, we leave our cars under the current ownership model parked and idle for what? On average, 95% of the time? Does the vehicle to grid vision depend on us continuing to do that?
Yeah, well, yes, of course. But whilst we think that actually car ownership is going to decline, and that's a whole nother, I think you're probably discussing that later today, the other models of ownership. So the numbers of vehicles we think will significantly. There are 30 million cars in the UK today, and we expect 8 to 10 million fully electric vehicles by 2030. But so yes, of course, this can't happen while cars are moving. But this is not the only source of storage, but it's a really important part of it. But to your point about so what's actually going in? So as we get more storage and we get cars putting power both ways, because the idea is that cars will take power as well as give power to the grid, depending on what the grid needs at that time. So it's not just about half time at the FA Cup and everyone puts the kettle on. We need all the cars. This is about continually balancing it. As we do that, the grid will continue to decarbonise, therefore more of our power coming in is green. But actually there's a whole nother world going allied to this, which is embedded renewable energy generation. So taking the power away from the power stations and generating it at your businesses or at home. There are over 1 million homes with solar PV now. So if you're charging your car at home, then during the day, then pretty much every bit of power going into your car is coming from your roof. And what's fascinating about that is that the research suggests that people who have their own solar energy generation on their roofs or in their own businesses are using 20% less power, because all of a sudden they're connected to this whole generation concept. But what we're seeing, the area we work in predominantly is in the commercial real estate world. So offices, shopping centres, retail parks, leisure venues. Huge. There's an awful lot of travel, parking, and people commuting, and what have you. And actually, what's brilliant is the government's saying 2050, but most of the big corporates are saying 2030 to 2040. In fact, many saying 2030. So we're involved, and this isn't a plug, but we're involved in some really interesting projects. We just started a project managing a carport project at a business park in Cambridge for one of a property trust, Henderson Property Trust. That's 500 kilowatts. So that's about 200 parking spaces. It's a solar carport with, I think, 20 car charging points. Now, the renewable energy on that site will generate 1.5 million miles, taking this out of leaf of 3 1/3 miles per kilowatt hour. 1.5 million miles of motoring. That's almost 1,900 cars on average. And that's 200 parking spaces. So actually there's this whole other thing going on out there where the private sector is doing these, and these don't need incentives. And that's what's really exciting, is solar and wind are the cheapest form of energy out there, bar none. So batteries will enable us to get more solar and wind onto the grid. And the Metro Centre up in the Gateshead is about to start the largest carport project in a public environment in the UK. 500 parking spaces, 1 megawatt of carports, 80 charging points. All of this is, that's actually been, to be fair, that is partly funded by the EU. But there's all sorts of really exciting things going on that a lot of people don't see.
No, I agree. It is really exciting, the extent to which rapidly falling costs of solar and wind mean that this stuff can get done without a policy revolution, without subsidies necessarily, without incentives. Look, thank you. As I said, let's quickly go to that slide. And then I want to come, if possible, to Jonathan Lass, who's been writing interesting stuff in the chat about the need for a strategic approach involving every stakeholder. I'd like to hear your take on that, and then we'll come back to Fredrika, because there's another section of this conversation I want to get to. Luke, can you explain this slide to us? Are you there?
Absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So essentially what we're looking at here is much in line with some of the points already made in the chat and in the conversation. But what's being demonstrated, or this figure is indicative of the significant difference in life cycle emissions between an electric vehicle, a Polestar 2, and a petrol internal combustion engine alternative, the XC40 running on petrol. These emissions being charted include the upstream energy supplier activities, manufacturing, logistics, as well as shown the use phase of the car, and then a small slice for the end of life phase, which includes the processes of dismantling and reusing some of the parts of the car. But the real point being made is that depending on the carbon intensity of the electricity used to charge the car, the overall footprint can be dramatically reduced. So just as John was saying, in the final bar on the right, which shows a Polestar 2 charged with a wind power and electricity mix, the life cycle emissions are dramatically reduced. And this is, that's the key point.
All right. Thanks very much, Luke. And I now want to cancel what I just said. I would like to come to Jonathan if we can. But first, I want to come back to Fredrika right away, if I can. Just because looking at that right-hand bar on this slide, clearly you don't have any of the blue stuff on top, which represents emissions from fuel, essentially. But, and I know that transparency is an important thing to you guys, do you think your customers or people considering buying EVs globally are fully aware that the manufacture of their cars does involve a substantial carbon footprint? And we were discussing before this call, I think it's a Polestar piece of data that there's a trust deficit in car manufacturers. What is it? A quarter of buyers don't trust car manufacturers. So two parts to the question. Do you think EV buyers are a little bit starry-eyed, or I mean, do you think they know about the carbon footprint of the actual manufacture of the vehicle? And if not, how do you level with them?
Well, I think they are a bit puzzled, I would say, because there are a lot of actors in the industry saying very conflicting things, putting out conflicting messages around EVs. So we at Polestar, we really want to demystify this and be clear about our findings, our data, to really have a more fact-based conversation about EVs. And as you saw in the bars, we have a huge challenge to get down to zero on the production-related emissions. And you saw how the Li-ion battery added a field where the fossil car had none.
Yeah.
So this is really what we need to talk about. Of course, the conversation we have today, how do we actually promote more renewable energy in the charging infrastructure, is important, but the industry has to turn now its focus from tailpipe emissions to the production-related emissions. And we're seeing a lot of opaque ways of going about this still. The industry has a problem with transparency since long. And if we are really to utilize the full potential of EVs in securing this route to climate neutrality and sustainable mobility, we have to embrace transparency. We have to get the consumers' trust in order for them to actually buy the products that we make, and feel like they're a part of a sustainable movement, which is so empowering. So that is why we at Polestar, we're gonna keep publishing the carbon footprint for our cars. We're gonna join our we're gonna welcome our consumers to join in on our reduction and decarbonization journey that we have, and hopefully guide them also into making more sustainable choices when charging.
Are you going to drill down as well and be upfront about the carbon cost of of the metals that
That
go
is
into the batteries and
absolutely.
the motors. This is going to be a huge issue, isn't it?
It is. It's going to be the biggest challenge for us, securing climate neutrality in the material production. So getting rid of direct emissions from aluminium production or indirect emissions from all of the fossil-based energy that is utilized in the industry supply chains today. So this is really where we're putting a lot of focus now. Right. Finding materials that are innovative, more sustainable, circular, that can actually decrease the carbon footprint of the car, and also working with our suppliers to support them in the transition to renewable energy, regardless if we produce in China or somewhere else.
Right, right. So as you mentioned, there's some opacity still there, which
opacity is the word. Thank you. Sorry.
No,
Swedish person trying to speak English here.
No, you opaque is a good word too, although transparent is better. Can we come to Jonathan? I was struck by what you put in the chat, not least because you describe yourself as a long-term EV driver. Tell us about what you regard as a proper strategic approach to this.
Giles, good morning. Good morning, everybody. So I'm coming at this as a consumer. I started with a G-Wiz, which I think are now obsolete, in 2007, with a range of 30 to 40 miles and 2 seats. And it was really a glorified golf cart, which couldn't drive on proper roads, except in central London where I live. And I've now got a plug-in hybrid. So I think my point to everybody is that this really, as a user, this is, and now with COP26 and our strategic plan, this really needs a strategic plan. It needs proper leadership, proper partnership by government, local government, industry, R&D, to really pull all the threads together if we're going to hit the targets for 2030. It's so huge that it needs really to bring all those elements in the mix to deliver. And what we need now, that needs to bring in battery research. We've heard about all the exciting things going on there. What is absolutely vital now, and we've never done it, is charging points which are both accessible but also plentiful. I live in a terrace. I can't charge my car easily because in East London, where I live, we have 8 charging points. So that's. At
least you've been able to charge your phone. That's good.
And that's the same more in many places in London. If you haven't got off-street parking, you haven't got a driveway, it's very difficult to charge your car. But even more difficult is all the charging points are not standardized. So if you've got a Tesla, they've got their own network. So there's no coordination on having consistent and standardized networks. So that you don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand that that's one of the crucial things that you have to have to make this successful. There ought to be obviously funding and grants, which should be going up, not down, if you want to get people to transition from petrol cars over the next 20 years. So it's a simple message, but it's one that people don't see. I don't know why, if government think this is important, you reduce the grants. And for example, one other final thing, Transport for London, in their wisdom, are abolishing the concession for plug-in hybrids in London from the congestion charge from this October. And in 2 years' time, Transport for London are going to withdraw the concession for congestion charge for all electric vehicles in 2025. And if that's a really good development to help spread EV, somebody needs their head examined.
Point taken, although there is the separate question of congestion. This city was built around horses, but point taken. Thank you, Jonathan. By the way, just very briefly, are you aware, do you have a model country that you look to elsewhere in the world that has taken this kind of a joined up approach that we could just copy and paste? You're on mute.
I thought Norway.
Oh yeah, certainly Norway looked pretty good in the slides. Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
Since Jonathan mentioned government, I'd like to come back to Kerry on that. And in particular, well, I'd like your reaction. Do you feel that in the event of a Labour government, you'd be ready to go with a strategic approach? But on this key point of standardising charging points, how do you wrangle the private sector stakeholders into line here? You've got Tesla, who are on a roll, but they're not letting. They have their own charging equipment that other cars can't use. How do you standardise that?
Yeah, I've had quite a few conversations with different energy companies and other people involved in the EV sector about this. It's a bit like mobile phone chargers, isn't it? And or your laptop chargers and that. I think it's starting to happen. I mean, there's been some consolidation, and one of the things that's a real problem. I've had an EV for 3 years, and you suddenly realise that you've got to subscribe to various networks. You've got to get a card before you can use it, or you've got to pay a monthly subscription, which if you don't use your car very often is just a waste of money. That is starting to disappear a bit, and there's now sort of various developments that mean that people should be able to use most of the charging points, leaving aside the Tesla thing. But as I understand it, in the sort of conversations I've had recently, it is moving in that direction. I suppose the question is, to what point would the government want to start to regulate that, to actually to sort of force that to happen? But I think my impression from conversations I've had is that it's moving in the right direction. Albeit I don't know if other people on here that are perhaps more sort of focused on the sort of technical side of things have a different view. But my impression is that the suppliers are starting to respond to that. Okay, so just to be clear, it's not a part of Labour policy to standardise the national charging. I don't think we've looked at it to that extent. I mean, I think the key thing that we focused on is these gaps. I've been sort of following the chat quite closely, and what you are getting, so like people have said that BP are starting to put in rapid, I've met with BP, and there's a question about whether they put these rapid charging points at their existing filling stations, or whether they put it somewhere where people stop for short times, like supermarkets or other places like that. But that's in areas where there's quite significant public demand. There's going to be the footfall. If you're actually looking at going, when I first got my car, I went round Dartmoor, and you suddenly realise that you're searching for a charging point, and then you're praying that when you get there it will actually work. And there's a real issue, and people have sort of said about the quality and the reliability, and I think that's absolutely something that we should be looking for. If people are providing charging points, they absolutely ought to be put on the spot in terms of regular repairs and making sure that they're there for people. So the question is, if you're talking about it might be like business travel, it might be tourism. If you've got people that are now doing these staycations down in Cornwall and Devon this year, or if they're going up to Northumberland or whatever, they need to be able to know that they can charge their EVs once they get off the motorway network. And that is just not, we're not going to be able to rely on the market to put those charging points in. And there's also a real issue because, the cost of grid connection obviously becomes higher if you go into the remote areas, and that's quite a deterrent to some companies looking at putting charging points in place. So I agree with what you're saying about the need to have some sort of conformity so that they're accessible to everyone. But I said I think also things like contactless, that's coming along, so you won't have to have the cards and sign up to particular providers. That seems to be happening. Okay. Thank you, Kerry. I'm conscious of time, and I do want to ensure that everybody has time to have a coffee and a pee before the next session. But I want to give John and Fredrika a chance to say a final word. John, first, can we focus on affordability? You were painting a seductive picture of a world in which most people have EVs. They are using the batteries, the big batteries in their EVs to feed back into the grid, to level out supply. They've also got panels on their roofs, which help feed charge the car in the first place, if they're lucky enough to. But that sounds like an expensive package.
looking at this with your consulting hat on, how do you make that big capital cost affordable for very large numbers of householders and consumers?
Gosh, okay, well, I mean, there's not a lot I can do about the cost of a car. That is the car manufacturers will set that. It's an interesting one because there's a bit of debate at the moment about the plug-in car grant. And, oh, is that me? The plug-in car grant being taken away, and our car manufacturers actually inflating the price, so that then it's not necessarily being passed on to consumers. That's not an area that I necessarily can give much assistance on. In making it affordable, I was looking at this last night. The average fuel consumption for a car, for a normal diesel car, is 39 miles per gallon. So that's going to cost you about £6. I calculated something like £6.50. You need to drive a Nissan Leaf the same distance, about 10.5 kilowatts. If you charge that at home, even without solar panels, just normally at home, that's going to cost you about £1.50. So the running costs on the road, forgetting about the servicing, are about 25% of what it costs to run a normal car. So if you look at what's this going to cost me to run the car, it's an absolute no-brainer. But the problem is that they are expensive to buy. But and then I think you'll be talking about this later, is the ownership models, because with cars sitting for 95%, and you're right, Charles, 95% of the time cars are sitting at home. And if you work out that an average car depreciates 60% in 3 years, it works out something like £500 a month of depreciation for your average family car.
Yeah.
Which is 18 or 20 pounds an hour for every hour you actually drive it. So you can see why people are moving away from that model. Yeah. But just something that Kerry mentioned if I just diverge a little bit on the charging network, this is a huge challenge for us, because what's stopping greater rollout, faster rollouts? A lot of it is the cost of connecting to the grid. Ofgem at the moment, who effectively oversee the grid operators and utility companies, they don't have baked into their objectives a decarbonising target. So it's not yet a formal target for them. It's a when you're making decisions, bear it in mind type situation, rather than a KPI, if you like, which is, and in my work at the Renewable Energy Association, this is something that we're really trying to raise. It's because they are the key to getting the grid to do the works they need to create the capacity, which means you can roll out more, charges. Last year, there were the growth in public charging was about 25%, and the growth in electric vehicle ownership was 150% plus. So we're lagging behind, and that's also stopping people from getting their electric cars, because they're worried. They're saying, is there enough charging out there? And there is this land grab as well. There are 40 networks in the UK. There's a land grab going on at the moment, and the government, to be fair, have a consultation about the consumer experience. What do consumers need in their charging network? And there's a whole dark art in this.
I'm going to stop you there, Sorry. John. One, because we're getting out of time, and another, because we're going to have another chance to get into some of the weeds of this in the next session. But let me come back to you, Fredrika, finally, on the question of the image of the industry. A couple of points in the chat here. Paul Barnfather is saying he likes the idea of the embodied carbon emitted in the manufacture to be shown on the sticker. That's an idea. And then Simon next after that is saying is talking about what happens to batteries at the end of their lives. These kinds of questions, and there are many of them in the chat and out there, are questions that, as everybody switches over, are really going to have to be addressed. How are you? And this is a form of words that we discussed before, didn't we? how are you going to make the industry part of the solution rather than part of the problem in terms of trust and transparency?
Yeah, as you pointed out when you started this session, we are at the cusp of the EV revolution. It's an amazing thing we're seeing and that we're getting to be a part of now, I think. And for us, it's really imperative that we now take the chance of really creating a movement that is going in the right direction as quickly as possible. We actually don't have 2 decades to transition into EVs. We need to see that transition on a large scale within this decade. We need to halve the emissions until 2030 on a global scale. So we need to really make sure that the industry is doing what it should, but also that we tap into the consumer power here. As we saw, an EV that is charged, I want to reiterate this, an EV that is charged with renewable energy has half the carbon footprint of a fossil car. That is an amazing impact. But in order to really see that that can come true, consumers need to be able to choose renewable energy when charging. And that is where transparency can create accountability amongst charging operators that will make sure that we really embrace that opportunity in a good way.
Very briefly, some of the things that I've underlined in red, Kerry's point that we need a second-hand market to make these affordable, that's really interesting. It also shows how tough it is going to be to make them affordable. John, on the beautiful thing about EVs being their capacity for storage, but again, that's part of a bigger picture that it's going to involve massive investment in renewable capacity. And Fredrika has acknowledged that it's going to be a huge challenge for the industry to get to net zero on production. We're committed to these cars, but there's a lot to do to realize their full environmental potential.